We are very excited to announce that this video essay is our very first sponsored one, and we really hope that our viewers will enjoy it. We will be discussing Saint Augustine's views on woman and womanhood, as he wrote extensively on these topics, and somehow we have missed including him earlier in our series. Thankfully, our attentive viewer has helped us rectify this injustice, and we have provided a detailed summary of the great saint's opinion on various topics related to women. If anybody else wants to sponsor a video about a saint or some other topic, please reach out to us on our Discord channel or via email. Saint Augustine's great work on the literal meaning of Genesis, written in the early 5th century, is a work that attempts to provide a careful and theological reading of the creation narratives in Genesis. One of the main elements of Saint Augustine's exegesis is the place of women in creation, more specifically, her role and relation to God and to man. His reflections are interesting and relevant since they reveal both the assumptions of late antiquity philosophy and Christian theology in order to better understand women. One of the most debated elements in Augustine's view is whether women, like man, is made in the image of God. In Genesis 1:27, Scripture says that God created man in his image, male and female he created them. On the one hand, Saint Augustine insists that the rational soul, which exists both in men and women, is the seat of the divine image. In this sense, the woman as an individual is fully the image of God, no less than how the man is. Both sexes, in Saint Augustine's opinion, possess the same type of rational capacity for wisdom and truth in relation with God. Yet, he introduces a distinction when considering woman's creation in relation to man. Saint Augustine argues that man more directly reflects the image of God in his capacity for leadership and spirituality, while woman was created as a helper, particularly in relation to the act of human procreation. Thus, while both are God's image, their functions differ. Man reaches God through spiritual headship, while woman complements him through her orientation toward childbearing and spousal partnership, which is the path towards her salvation. In Genesis 2, Eve is formed from Adam's side, and for Saint Augustine, this is not mere symbolism, but a profound theological lesson. Woman shares the same substance as man, indicating ontological equality, but at the same time, the order of creation reflects a divinely ordained hierarchy, with the man as the head. Saint Augustine cites Saint Apostle Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 11, that man is the head of woman, as a product of this divine order. Another aspect of Saint Augustine's interpretation appears when he considers the rational capacities of men and women, in which he describes women's reasoning as more oriented toward the practical and temporal order, whereas man's reason is more properly directed to contemplation of the eternal and God. In On the Literal Meaning of Genesis, Saint Augustine also considers the reason why woman was created at all. He rejects the idea that she was created in order to act as a helper in labor or companionship alone, since another man could fulfill those roles. Instead, he concludes woman was created primarily as a helper in procreation. This emphasis reflects Saint Augustine's belief that childbearing was essential to the fulfillment of the human race's vocation to multiply and fill the earth, as proclaimed by God. Nevertheless, Saint Augustine does not reduce marriage to reproduction alone. He affirms that there is also a companionship between man and woman, even if he regards this as a secondary activity that women do. In his monumental work, The City of God, Saint Augustine reflects on a wide range of topics, including love of God and the position of women. Saint Augustine expands his view on women from his previous work that explains Genesis. In The City of God, Book 14, he reiterates that both man and woman are made in the image of God, with the woman being a helper of the man, especially for procreation and companionship. St. Augustine's discussion of the fall shows that he acknowledges that Eve was deceived by the serpent, while Adam sinned knowingly. Yet, rather than blaming women uniquely for sin, Saint Augustine argues that Adam's willful disobedience as head of the human race was more serious, and thus sin entered the world. In this way, the saint both echoes the archetype of feminine weakness while also preserving the woman from being scapegoated as the sole cause of humanity's downfall from paradise. Saint Augustine also discusses sexuality and marriage within the city of God. While both men and women share in the bodily corruption of the fall, Saint Augustine often associates women more closely with physical weakness and temptation. In Book 15, he praises marriage as a genuine good, established for procreation and sacramental unity under the sight of God. Women, as wives and mothers, are essential to the unfolding of God's plan for the human race, to be fruitful and multiply. Yet, Saint Augustine holds virginity and celibacy in higher esteem, considering nuns to have a foretaste for the angelic life that's to come in the city of God. One of the most interesting passages in the City of God comes in Book 1, where Saint Augustine responds to the pagan mocking of Christian women that were attacked and dishonored during the sack of Rome by the barbarians. He insists that these nuns and other Christian women did not lose their chastity, for chastity is a matter of the will, not of what is involuntarily suffered or done to them, as spiritual faithfulness takes priority over the physical. Finally, Saint Augustine, in Book 22, teaches that women will also rise in the resurrection with their gender intact, as they will not become men, but will maintain their own bodily distinctions given to them by God. In his next book, On the Good of Marriage, Saint Augustine was responding to a pastoral challenge of his time regarding the prominence of celibacy over marriage. Many people were arguing that virginity and celibacy were the only truly holy ways of living ordained by God. Marriage was seen as a spiritually inferior, or at best, a concession to human weakness. Saint Augustine, himself a former ascetic of the Manichaean persuasion, sought to defend the dignity of marriage without abandoning the Christian tradition that held monasticism in special honor. His treatise presents marriage as a genuine good in its own right, sanctified by God himself. At the heart of Saint Augustine's argument lies his famous teaching on the three goods of marriage: procreation, fidelity, and sacramental permanence. The first and most obvious good is procreation, and Saint Augustine emphasizes that wives are honored as mothers, bearers of children who will continue the human race and will respect the will of God. Fidelity, the second good, signifies the exclusive bond between husband and wife in terms of faithfulness. Saint Augustine argues against the common pagan practice of the time that excused male infidelity and harshly punished female ones, saying that fidelity is owned by both partners. Adultery is equally sinful, whether committed by a man or a woman. The third good, sacrament, refers to the indissoluble unity of husband and wife in the eyes of God. Wives, like husbands, are bound by this permanent covenant, which reflects the unbreakable union of Christ and his Church. Saint Augustine also teaches about seeking sexual unions for pleasure and not procreation. While he insists that procreation should be the main focus of these actions, nonetheless, Saint Augustine does not deny marital intimacy realities. Both the wife and the husband have claims on each other's bodies, and even if they seek relations without the desire for children, they can still be redeemed by charity, since they fulfill the mutual service of marriage. Finally, Saint Augustine places women in marriage alongside nuns, even though he values celibacy as higher callings. Marriage, far from being a concession to lust, is a sacrament that embodies virtues pleasing to God, and married women should not be despised for their apparent weaknesses. In the next book, On the Trinity, Saint Augustine more or less reiterates the previously discussed points that women are equally made in the image of God because the image resides in the rational soul. not the body. However, he upholds gender distinctions. Man represents contemplation and headship, while woman represents temporal order and procreation. Within marriage, woman is subject to man, but in essence she is his equal, sharing equally in rationality and salvation. Saint Augustine also makes use of feminine imagery to describe the human soul and the Church. In On Holy Virginity, Saint Augustine addresses one of the most prominent developments in the Christian life of his time, the growing number of women who consecrated themselves to Christ by choosing lifelong virginity and entering monasticism. This treatise stands as a companion to his On the Good of Marriage. The main point of Saint Augustine's argument is the idea that virginity, for the sake of Christ, is a special calling, not a universal command. The virgin is not superior in nature to the married woman, but she has chosen a way of life that anticipates the resurrection, when there will be no marrying or giving in marriage. In consecrated virginity, nuns testify to the coming kingdom, embodying in their very bodies the eschatological promise that human desire will be wholly directed to God. For St. Augustine, this choice represents freedom from the earthly obligation of procreation, a freedom that allows women to live entirely in service of Christ and his Church. At the same time, St. Augustine is insistent that the gift of virginity must be guarded with humility and modesty. He warns nuns against pride, vanity, and other vices against their married sisters. Virginity, he argues, is not a human achievement to boast of, but a grace of God entrusted to fragile vessels in order for them to become greater. A nun who remains bodily chaste, but succumbs to arrogance or greed, is no true virgin of Christ. For St. Augustine, physical virginity must be matched by the virginity of the soul, purity of heart, devotion to God, and an unending pursuit of Christian virtues. He even admonishes nuns against outward displays of their consecration, reminding them that modesty and discretion are essential to the holiness of their vocation. Saint Augustine bases his praise of virginity in the figure of the Theotokos, whom he regards as the supreme model of womanhood, as she is unique in being both virgin and mother, uniting in herself the goods of marriage and the excellence of consecrated life. In her, Saint Augustine sees the archetype of the Church itself, ever virgin and yet fruitful. Nuns participate in the example of the Theotokos, though none can ever equal her. Moreover, the witness of nuns is not only personal but also ecclesial, as their service towards God benefits not only themselves, but everybody's salvation. The last work discussed in this essay is St. Augustine's On the Good of Widowhood, which was commissioned by the noblewoman Juliana Anicia, who wanted a treatise for her daughter, a young widow. Having already discussed marriage and virginity, St. Augustine finalizes his works pertaining to women with a book on widows. St. Augustine begins by asserting that widowhood itself is a good state of life, worthy of honor. Widowhood is not an unfortunate accident or a lesser situation, but a path in which a Christian woman can grow in holiness. Widowhood flows naturally out of marriage. A widow once lived in the good of matrimony, and her present state continues that goodness in a new form. In fact, he praises women who remain faithful to the memory of their late husbands, seeing in this fidelity a witness to the sacrament's indissolubility. Just as Christ's union with the Church endures forever, so too a widow's continued faithfulness reflects the permanence of marital love. However, St. Augustine carefully balances this praise with freedom, as he does not condemn remarriage, considering it indeed lawful and good. A widow is free to remarry if she chooses, and no one should despise her for it. Still, St. Augustine suggests that remaining in widowhood is the better way, since it allows for undivided devotion to God. Much of the treatise, however, is devoted to moral exhortation, as St. Augustine recognizes that widowhood, like monasticism, can become a source of temptation, and great pride. He warns women against arrogance, reminding them that their condition is not a personal achievement, but a circumstance allowed by God for their betterment. He urges them not to fall into vanity, gossip, pride, or idleness, temptations that could make them stray away from their life of prayer. Nor should widows rush into another marriage out of lust. Widows, Saint Augustine mentions, have a respected place in the life of the Church, echoing St. Apostle Paul's order of the widows, who do service to the Christian community. By elevating continence while affirming the goodness of remarriage, St. Augustine sets widowhood in the same hierarchy he uses elsewhere. Marriage is good, widowhood is better, virginity is best. Overall, St. Augustine's view on women is a very detailed one that situates womanhood alongside manhood as divine products of God's power in his own image. While women have to submit spiritually to their man, the human nature they possess is identical to that of the man. St. Augustine also discussed a lot about the goods of marriage, monastic life, and widowhood, praising each and issuing strong warnings against potential abuses in each case. In conclusion, St. Augustine is one of the best choices to consult when delving deeper into the relationships between man and woman, and when somebody is contemplating monastic life, especially from a woman's point of view. Thank you again to our sponsor, and if anybody else wants a similar video made for their saint or topic of choice, please reach out to us via Discord or email. Thank you for watching, and have a blessed day.